So, as we watch white America descend into, well, the hellscape that it is now, now's a good time to remind everyone that for everyone else in the world, this is who America has always been. Case in point today, the Philippines. Philippines is one of the most important countries if you want to talk about the history of America and understanding what America is, because the Philippines is really America's first real colony and it's where it really gets to first flex its imperialist muscle. And the things America will do in the Philippines will make your blood run cold. Let's go through a few select moments, shall we? The first real interaction between the Philippines and America happens during the Spanish-American War in 1898. This is when basically the Spanish Empire, which is already collapsing, and America just goes and pushes them over and takes their colonies. They take Cuba, they take the Philippines, and America becomes a new colonial superpower. Although they don't admit this, they still think freedom, democracy, all of that. But it's nonsense. It's a colonial power. And so after that war finishes, there's this thing called the Treaty of Paris. And America basically says, we're going to take over the Philippines. And the Filipinos are saying, hey, we've been fighting for our independence for, decades now. We'd like to be free. And America says, no, you're not. You're going to be a colony now. And then this erupts into the Philippine-American War, which goes for about 4 years until 1902. And, well, calling it a war is not really fair. It's a genocide, let's be honest. Up to 1 million Filipinos will be massacred during this war, and eventually the Philippines will be forced to just accept America as their overlord. Then for the next 30 years, you've got US colonial rule, and it is, well, unpleasant to say the least. It mainly manifests in economic exploitation, as everything America does overseas turns into. Basically, American corporations come and take over the sugar industry, the tobacco industry, the mining industry. They own all of the land, and basically rich Americans get to go and be overseers, basically, in the Philippines. And they justify this by saying, we're bringing culture to this land. We're teaching them to speak English. We're bringing new systems of governance to these savages, and all that Western colonial nonsense. But tensions, of course, keep flaring up, and in 1934, there's this thing called the Tidings-McDuffel Act, where the US basically grants limited independence to us, and they start acting like they're friends. Like they call them our little brother. The Philippines is our little brother, and we're going to look after them. That doesn't last very long. Because a few years after this, World War II breaks out and the Japanese invade the Philippines, and America just abandons it, basically. They abandon the Filipinos to their fate, and they are occupied under brutal Japanese occupation for a long time. You could argue there wasn't much America could do about this, but I think that's a cop-out. I think America was more than strong enough to defend the Philippines if they had really cared enough to do so. But they don't, and there's a lot of documented evidence about this. You see a lot from the Philippine president at the time begging for help from Americans, and they just don't really do anything. But then, of course, Americans do eventually show up in 1945 when Douglas MacArthur, the great American general, lands and says, I have returned. There's this big battle, the Battle of Manila, which you never hear Americans talk about. They love their war history, right? So why don't they want to talk about the Battle of Manila? Well, it's because this is the only urban battle America will ever fight in the Pacific in World War II. And it is a disaster. Basically, they just completely level the city of Manila to kick the Japanese out with absolutely no regard for civilian lives. They will kill about 100,000 Filipinos just in Manila, just with their artillery and street fighting, just absolutely no care whatsoever. But after World War II, America finally comes to its senses and says, okay, we think Philippines deserves its independence. But there's a little asterisk after that, and it basically says, yes, the Filipinos will be independent. However, all US companies still have equal rights to their resources and will count as Philippine residents for any commercial purposes. Basically meaning that all of the Philippines' resources still belong to American hands, American corporations. So there's not really independence, it's just on paper. And then, of course, in 1947, it's about 2 years after World War II, there's the military bases agreement where the US basically uses the Philippines as a floating aircraft carrier, and they just set up military bases everywhere. The most famous one being, of course, Clark Air Base, which has a long history of US military personnel being abusive to the locals, we'll just put it that way. Go look it up if you really want to know the details. You don't. Then in the Cold War era, you start seeing the rise of communism across the Pacific, of course, and it becomes quite prevalent in the Philippines for understandable reasons. The Americans have not been good friends to the Filipinos, and communism is basically saying throw off your colonial masters, throw off this capitalist exploitation, comrades, and unite workers worldwide. Americans don't like this, and the CIA goes into the Philippines and they commit all sorts of atrocities. And eventually they will install a US puppet government, a guy he's very famous, named Ferdinand Marcos. And he will be given a lot of power by the Americans, basically purely because he will go and kill all the communists. But then in 1991, the US bases are withdrawn and America tries to normalize relations with the Philippines and, let's just forget all the past, guys, and let's rebuild a new mutually beneficial relationship. This lasts less than 10 years because once the war on terror happens, the US decides to reassert military presence over the Philippines and the military bases come back. The US will then basically spend every year after that really ramping up any anti-communist activities on the island, and eventually they will really support one of the more recent presidents, Rodrigo Duterte. And Americans will help him commit all sorts of atrocities on the island. There's even US airstrikes that were happening in the Philippines. You never heard that on the news, did you? But it happened. And that kind of brings us to the present day, where the Philippines is again being used as a US military base to antagonize and contain China. But you'll notice that the Chinese have not actually committed any of these atrocities. This is all America. But according to the Americans, it's China that's being the aggressive colonial superpower. But, the legacy of this is a great example of what US intervention and US imperialism is really like. Like, if you look at just the mainstream sources, you will hear Americans talk about their Filipino friends and how they came and helped the Philippines and how they've been great allies. But if you go and look at the history, the very, very long and very bloody history of America in the Philippines, you see the reality. And once you see that reality, you can begin to understand that it's like this anywhere America goes. If there's an American military base in your country, it is very likely you have a story very similar to this, as I've made many videos on in the past. Anyway, hopefully that's something to think about.